Thank you, Somi. That feels good to take a second to just breathe. Um, well, next up we have um, Dr. Pamela Palmater with us today. We're very excited. I'm just going to say a few words about Pam to introduce her this afternoon. So Dr. Pamela Palmater is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, author, and social justice activist from Eel River Bar First Nation in New Brunswick. She has 4 university degrees, including a BA from St. Thomas in Native Studies, an LLB from the University of New Brunswick, and her master's and Doctor of Laws from Dalhousie University, specializing in Indigenous law. She currently holds the position of full professor and chair in Indigenous governance at Toronto Metropolitan University. A lawyer in good standing for 23 years, Pam has been researching, working, volunteering, and advocating on Indigenous issues for over 30 years on a wide range of issues, including inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights, climate change, Indigenous territories, domestic and international human rights of Indigenous peoples, and so much more. Pam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is just amazing, and I'm so glad I got to catch Grand Chief Tremblay's talk. But first, let me introduce myself. Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. I am from the sovereign nation of the Mi'kmaq on unceded territory in Mi'kma'ki. My home community is Ugbaganjig, which is Eel River Bar First Nation. And Grand Chief Tremblay, thank you so much for all of the work you do on language. Language has everything in it. I don't need to tell you, it's our worldviews, it's our values, it's our histories, it's what we care about, all of our knowledges. I mean, I'm always astounded when I hear the name of a river, which means this is the river that has no fish. I mean, because the knowledge is literally right in that. So thank you. You're just listening to your voice makes me feel like I'm back home, even though I'm far away right now. And, you know, Waliwan, for the work that you do protecting Wolastoqey territory, as well as language and culture, because for those who don't know, Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey nations are sister nations, and we have worked together forever, and our families are all intermarried, and we're part of a bigger confederacy. So we're really close, and we care very much about protecting Mother Earth. And thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me. I always love it when they give me the option of what I want to talk about or where I want to focus. They're like, here's the general area, and you know, go ahead. And they weren't afraid of the fact that I tend to be a little bit more on the direct side of things, not so sugar-coaty. So thanks for that. I appreciate it, because this conference is something unique in the sense that it's obviously environmental learning, Indigenous knowledges, and youth activism put together, because those are the things that are going to get it done. Those are the things that help us provide a good future for our generations. That's where all of my faith is. And notice how there's no word corporation or government in that whole phrase. You know, it's environmental learning, Indigenous knowledges, and youth activism. That's where we're going to get it done. But today, I should let you know that I'm coming to you from the sovereign territory of Mississaugas of Scugog. That's another nation whose lands and resources were stolen. Despite signing treaties, there was a lot of fraud involved, and they've never had their rights fully respected in any way. And they have to fight every day to protect their wetlands from being paved over, or the green belt here in Ontario from being devastated by developers. And so really the lesson is, it doesn't matter where you live or from which country or nation you originate. We always have an obligation to stand in solidarity with the local First Nation and follow their calls to action. So the Haida could be calling for action in their territory, but if you're here in Ontario, you need to follow the local calls to action. And for me, it's Mississaugas of Scugog, because ultimately we're all in this together. Some people think that they're not, that they think they can buy their way out of any of the damage that happens. But ultimately, our collective futures are woven together as one. So thanks for joining thanks for all of the attendees, the speakers, the elders, Grand Chief, the organizers, or people who are just observing, because the work we do here is literally life-saving. And it's our collective future. And when I say collective, I mean you and I, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, Canadians and Americans, and literally all living things on the planet. So it's in your best interest to care about, learn about, work alongside Indigenous peoples in our work protecting the lands, waters, plants, animals, fish, birds, and yes, even things like insects and spiders. None of us can escape the fact that what happens to Indigenous peoples and plants and animals will continue to impact you in very serious ways. And how's that? Well, it's what I'm going to talk to you about today. How does this happen? Well, it's because ecocide and genocide go hand in hand. You cannot treat one without treating the other. They're so tied together. To put it bluntly, when we kill Indigenous peoples, and we do, we are killing life on the planet. And when we destroy the environment, we destroy Indigenous lives. The two are so closely related. It's like a vicious circle of life and abundance and happiness and health and safety and security, or it's a vicious circle of violence and death and destruction and harm and suffering. It's entirely up to us which future that we make for all of us. And while we're all not politicians or prime ministers or presidents, we have a lot more power than we think we do. And that's what I want to talk to you about, because this conversation is always hard, but it's based on facts. This conversation's always upsetting and sometimes even offending to some people, but it's necessary. None of us can avoid it, even if we, want to turn the TV off. We are in a human and climate crisis of epic proportions, where every single day matters, literally every single day. And if we are to put an end to the violence that's committed against Indigenous peoples and Mother Earth, then we have to be honest and direct about it. There's no sugarcoating this. So the only responsible thing I've ever been able to do is what Grand Chief Tremblay is talking about. Tell it like it is, based on fact and with honesty, no matter how hard the message is. And I know that a lot of you on here, because, just the fact that you're here, you've already worked hard to understand our collective histories, the current challenges we have, our relationship with the environment, everything that we face. Some of you might be newish to the struggle. And when I say newish, I mean, maybe you've always studied environmental issues, environmental science, environmental law, environmental policy, but maybe you haven't as fulsomely studied the relationship that Indigenous peoples have to the land and the relationship that you have with Indigenous peoples to the land. And so this conversation is really for all of you. And I cannot wait till we get to the question side of things. So make sure you write it down so you don't forget it, because the best part of this is really the questions and the engagement. So here's what we know right now at this stage. The National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls found Canada guilty of both historic genocide, but even more importantly, maybe ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples. Canada, and when I say Canada, that's the federal government, provincial government, municipal governments, territorial governments, corporations, some segments of society. Canada has used genocidal laws, policies, and practices that specifically target Indigenous women and girls in very unique and devastating ways. All Indigenous peoples, but specifically targeted Indigenous women and girls. And that's important when we get around to the conversation about the environment. We know that Indigenous women and girls are targeted in Canada, but also in the United States, in Mexico, Peru, and other colonized countries in very similar ways. So let's start with the definition of genocide, because here's where the conversation always gets unnecessarily hard or controversial. And that's mainly because some people who don't study genocide or don't study history, or don't study genocide law, or maybe don't work at the United Nations, misunderstand that genocide, the standard of genocide, is the Holocaust. Now, that was one of the worst Holocausts in the history of the planet, one of, but it's not the standard, because genocide isn't measured by the number of people that are killed, how they're killed, or the time frame, whether it took a year, 50 years, or more. That's the thing about genocide. So to understand it, you have to look at each genocide separately. They all come from a different historical context, social context, political context. Like, everything that happened around the world is different and unique. So they're not comparable. It's not, and it wouldn't be proper to try to compare or have a race for the worst genocide ever. All genocides are bad. And genocide is defined in the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide as the intention to destroy, in whole or in part. So not, it doesn't have to be everybody. It can be some of the buddies, a racial group. So the intention to destroy in whole or in part a racial group like First Nations. And to be guilty of genocide, you need only, and I say only with respect, to commit one of 5 acts, just one. Any one of them will make you guilty of genocide. Obviously, killing members of a group, so killing First Nations people. Or 2, creating serious bodily or mental harm, no doubt about that. Or inflicting the conditions of life, like starvation policies, meant to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. Imposing measures intended to prevent births in people. So think about forced sterilizations, for example, or the forced transfer of children from that group to another group. And I mean, Canada's already admitted it has a humanitarian crisis when it comes to the forced transfer of children into the foster care system. So Canada only needed to be guilty of one of those things, and it's guilty of all 5. Not just through history, but right now. And that's the thing that I think people really don't understand, or don't see how it's tied to the environment and what's happening in the environment. And here's the thing about genocide. Don't listen to any armchair coffee analysts, because it's no longer a debate. It's not a question. It's a fact, legal fact. Now well accepted by Canada, by the Prime Minister. It's been acknowledged by the United Nations, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So everyone's well aware of it. But just the fact that we know about it, you know how public education, we always think once they know better, they'll do better. That's a myth. You can't take that for granted, because we've known about the genocide for a long time, but we failed to act on it. And even if you only found out about it last year, what have you done in the last year to end the genocide of Indigenous peoples? And that's the question. So historical acts of genocide, scalping bounties, pay settlers to kill Native people, remove them from the lands, the sharing of smallpox blankets, starvation policies, abuse, tortures, and death in residential and day schools, forced sterilization, 60 scoop forced adoptions, the removal of First Nation women and kids from their First Nations because of the Indian Act, or the incarceration and killing of First Nations people. And I can tell you, every single one of those things continues to happen today under a different policy name. So when you think about the deaths of people, you've got chronic and discriminatory underfunding of things like food, water, housing, or access to healthcare. The foster care crisis is worse now than during the residential school era. And some children in foster care still suffer physical and sexual abuse and deaths at higher rates. We still have forced and coerced sterilizations and abortions. I mean, there's multiple class actions right now begging Canada to stop engaging in these acts. And think about that involves, it's not just about directing people to do that. That's doctors, nurses, social workers, police officers, all involved in that kind of genocide. And still, the Indian Act, which was enacted in 1876, has a disappearing Indian formula that, if allowed to continue, and which disproportionately impacts First Nation women and all of our descendants, results in a knowable, calculable legislative extinction date for First Nations. How do I know that? Because the government did the statistics behind it and they defend it every single time in court. So you can't say, whoops, we committed genocide by mistake. No, because it requires intention. And the National Inquiry found very specifically that although Canada has stated things differently or has other stated objectives, like, let me see if you heard this one, there's no relationship more important than the one with Indigenous peoples. Despite what they say, their actions and what they're doing behind the scenes still has the intention to forcibly assimilate and forcibly destroy First Nations. And this genocidal policy, which used to be known as Indian policy, has primarily targeted Indians or First Nations. Inuit are impacted now, and then Métis, they have been around, Métis Nation have been around for, a couple hundred years, so that now they're impacted, but the target was always Indians and the treaties. And right now, we have the highest incarceration rate of First Nations ever. It's exploded. And the killing of unarmed First Nations people by police officers, which the Maritimes knows all too well. So let's pretend you didn't know about genocide. These are grave human rights violations. These are grave criminal offenses. And altogether, they amount to ongoing genocide. It's literally the worst crime that can be committed on the planet. Yet we talk about this as if it's just another story we're talking about in the news. Yes, thousands of women are being murdered and disappeared and exploited anyway in other news, as if it's just an issue. Instead of declaring this a national emergency and taking emergency, multi-government approach to address it and making that the funding priority, the legal priority, the, protection priority. Because if they did that, that would also indirectly, but also directly impact the priority for protecting the planet and addressing ecocide. So Canada's facing its worst human rights crisis that it's ever seen. But the other crisis is ecocide. Ecocide is committed on First Nation territories every single day, or on Native American territories, or on Maori territories, or on sovereign Native Hawaiian territories, you name it. And just like genocide, it's been normalized and justified. And when I talk about, irreparable damages caused by ecocide, things that you can't ever save again, they're justified on the basis of wealth generation, jobs. I mean, I don't know how many times I hear jobs, or in fact, political power at the national or international level. You rarely hear any government official talk about the needs of hummingbirds having a priority over, say, I don't know, Trans Mountain Pipeline. You never hear about the government all of a sudden one day appropriating $7 billion to save some endangered species. But the money comes out of the air when it comes to pipelines. So we need to better understand genocide in that way, because it's a word, like I said, that's been normalized as if it's just GDP, stock prices, economic growth, that all of that trumps human rights and planetary rights. And, some people have asked me, what's the definition of ecocide? It sounds like a made up word. Well, in fact, it's not. It's something that's been around a long time. It's obviously connected to environmental racism and all of these other issues. But at the international and legal level, the basic definition goes something like this. It is the unlawful, wanton, reckless, neglectful acts that are committed knowing that there is a significant risk or likelihood that your actions will cause severe, widespread, long-term, or irreparable harm and damage to the environment. In other words, it's when you intentionally commit mass destruction of things in the natural living world, our own home, for example. And that's the very same world that all other living things depend on. Humans and southern resident killer whales and hummingbirds and bees that pollinate our food. And the thing about ecocide is we often point to government about genocide or ecocide. And it's true, they have a lot of power and they've committed a lot of horrific abuses. But both can be committed by individuals, corporations, and governments. So that's the same. Either way, ecocide and genocide are crimes, but they're crimes for which few are ever held to account. The unlawful actions committed with the knowledge that there's going to be a heavy price to pay for the destruction of something in the environment is often made under the guise of, well, it's not going to hurt me, or it's not going to hurt me in the here and now. That's something for someone else to worry about. Or as former Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney said, well, if you don't drill for the oil, Russia's going to drill for the oil. Like, good grief. We've come up with every kind of fear mentality to make people think it's inevitable. There's no way around it. Just be practical, just be reasonable. And we're selling ourselves out. We're selling out our current lived realities and the future of our children and the future of animals on the planet. It's incredulous. The crimes of ecocide and genocide, they're incredulous, but they're so normalized. People don't see it as crimes. It's criminal, but it's out in the open. It's not like they're committing subversive crimes that no one sees. It's out there. I mean, how many times do pipeline companies breach all of the environmental rules? I mean, without consequence. And it's dangerous. It should be our number one concern. Genocide and ecocide that's happening right now, but it's pretty much ignored. Or, you know how people don't know how to argue sometimes in the media, and you'll say, what about the genocide of Indigenous peoples? And they'll be like, hey, yeah, but what about that one guy who made a really high salary in that community? And it's like completely unrelated. And that's just a racist response, but that's also been normalized. So if we're going to address ecocide, and I'm pretty sure that everyone here who's watching wants to address ecocide and the destruction of the environment, you cannot do that without putting an equal amount of time, effort, energy, and focus into genocide. They go together, and we have to address both together. Like, literally, they're inseparable. The pain of Indigenous peoples that is felt from ongoing genocide is the very same pain that the planet feels when land defenders, water protectors, activists, and warriors are incarcerated or die. Literally, the planet, it's losing its defenders. And the pain of the planet, which is felt from ongoing acts of ecocide, is felt first and foremost by who? Indigenous peoples. We're disproportionately impacted by lack of access to water, contaminated water, climate change, melting ice, droughts, floods, deforestation, overfishing, or air pollution. It hits us first, and it hits us hard. So it's inseparable. Lands, waters, plants, animals, fish, birds, people all depend on the same planet. You know, despite what anybody might say, we're not going to be living on the planet Mars anytime soon. And so settler governments, especially in countries, colonial countries like Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, especially those ones who have colonized Indigenous territories with horrific acts of violence to both the territories and the people, they have developed a governing system, a legal system, an economic system that is 100% tied to the extractive mentality, like our dependence on extraction and exploitation and colonization is what harms us. Some people talk about capitalism, and there's a whole bunch of, political blah, blah, blah about capitalism, whether it's good, whether it exists, whether it's monopolized, whatever. but it's this colonial mentality of extraction and exploitation, no matter what the costs are or anybody else's health, safety, or rights. That's what's gotten us into trouble. And the biggest offenders, obviously, I don't need to tell you, are governments, but also these corporations or transnational corporations. So corporations in Canada that also act around the world. They exploit the people and the ecosystem as if they were commodities. Imagine water as a commodity. Imagine the human trafficking of people and treating people as a commodity. So the extractive economy upon which we're trapped in. So don't let anyone say, oh, but you're a hypocrite because you drove your car to your medical appointment. We're not a hypocrite. This is the world that was created by other people that we're literally trapped in and trying to find our way out of. It's not hypocritical at all. They've left us no other options. So it's this extractive economy is the heart of our economy, and it leaves destruction. Inevitably, it leaves destruction to Indigenous women and girls, lands and waters. And this, sometimes we separate ourselves from it. Like, I just won't watch the news. I just won't be on social media. Well, me and my neighborhood, we're doing pretty good. And that's really ignoring reality, because if you pay attention to the media at all, any kind of news, you'll see the countless tears from Indigenous mothers whose daughters have been murdered or kidnapped. I mean, how many years do we have to see that before we take action? But at the same time, literally at the same time, we see the heartbreak of Southern resident killer whale mothers mourn the loss of their babies who can't survive in oil tanker dominated ecosystems. I mean, you couldn't get any more of a message. I mean, do you remember that poor Southern resident killer whale mama who, in an unusual move, kept her deceased baby afloat for the longest that scientists have ever seen? I mean, how much more do they have to speak to us to get us to pay attention and notice that that was a mother, a female killer whale? So if we don't act quickly, we know more people are going to die. The planet is already dying around us. I mean, David Suzuki calls it the Anthropocene, which has been the most devastating. And here's some of the ways in which we get trapped. We get bogged down in debating politics. Well, I support the Liberal government no matter what they do. Well, I support the Conservatives or NDP or Greens or whomever. Blind support. And when I say blind support, I mean you're either voting for the person that you like, so de facto it's a Liberal, or you're voting for the Liberals because the Conservatives are so horrible. And yes, that's true. But it's, well, what about all of their, you can't just blindly accept the whole package that they come with. You have to challenge governments because it's a matter of life and death, or we get caught up in religion and what one religion believes versus another, what we should do to humans or the planet, or we get caught up in self-interest. Well, I work in the oil fields, so that's my job. So we should just keep them going. When there are a multitude of programs now to transition out of being an oil worker, to also have a fulfilling job that can pay for your family's needs without also destroying the planet. But we don't have those discussions enough on the policy table. And it's not going to be good enough in 50 years to say, oh, we tried so hard. We rallied so hard. We had the best of intentions. We had a good effort. We're at a situation right now where we either do or die. And right now, the things that are dying the most are Indigenous peoples and the environment. And yes, this requires education. As you know, I am on every social media. I go on mainstream media. I do everything to help educate the public about these things. But I do it with a view to action. So education for action, not awareness, because you know all of this. I mean, you might not know all the details, but you know this. This isn't new. I haven't met anyone in Canada yet who doesn't know that there's problems. Every survey that's ever been done says the vast majority of Canadians know there's a problem with the environment and with genocide of Indigenous peoples. Obviously, we're still talking about it. So being aware doesn't translate into action. And then what action? Donating to a land defender once? That's not going to cut it. It's needed. It's desperately needed to help pay their legal bills, for example, or provide food and water while they're out on the land. But we're looking at this all wrong. We have to go way beyond awareness and find a way to educate in a way that inspires long-term, sustained, substantial, radical, impactful action on a forever basis. And you might say, oh, well, that's quite a job to do this forever. Yes, we want to protect the planet forever. We want people to be protected from violence forever. Our treaties, at least here in the Maritimes, are for our heirs and our heirs forever. We committed to this. So we don't get to pick and choose which laws we follow and which ones we don't. To do otherwise is actually breaking the law. It's making us all outlaws. Participating in it and acquiescence of it is also criminal. We can no more deny climate change, and I'm sure you've heard a million people who do, Pierre Poilievre. We can no longer deny climate change any more than we can deny that the genocide of Indigenous peoples. But we know people do, certain people, large, powerful corporations, government officials who are trying to protect themselves from liability, any one individual that has close ties to the extractive industry, police forces and other law enforcement agencies with vested interests in the extractive industry, and far-right hate groups. And I know far-right hate groups doesn't get a lot of attention in the sense of their role in genocide and ecocide, but listen, it's not just far-right groups, hate groups, promoting hate and violence and misinformation and conspiracy theories, because that's bad enough in terms of just trying to educate kids or the public. But these white supremacists, white nationalists, neo-Nazis, they're all closely linked to certain ideologies, in addition to all of their, conspiracy theories. They're closely linked and part of the gun lobby. They're closely linked and part of police and law enforcement agencies and big oil. I mean, that should be no surprise. But here's where the twist in politics comes. Increasingly, at least according to the statistics, big oil is lining up to defend, support, and partially fund far-right groups, people engaged in far-right movements like the so-called Freedom Convoy. They're supporting and lining up behind far-right authoritarians across the world because they're desperate that the majority of humans don't want fossil fuels forever, don't want our planet to die, don't want human beings to be killed in the process. And so they're lining up behind right-wing leaders. And you can see that in all of their really outrageous YouTube rants and podcasts and everything else. They're holding up people like Pierre Poilievre. They're holding up the gun lobby and big oil and people like Donald Trump. And they're doing that for a reason. They're at mutual benefit. They are literally tied together. Just like ecocide and genocide are tied together, so too is far-right extremism and ecocide. Big oil executives are appointed to government positions. Former government officials are hired by big oil to sit on corporate boards. So we know that they too are inextractable. And that's where we need to look at the intersection of those things, how mutually dependent they are on one another. So you can create weaknesses in those links if you are aware of them and can target those links. Think about the insurrection at the Capitol in the United States. How many hate groups were a part of that? Police officers were a part of that, current and former military, and companies who support big oil. Freedom Convoy. Oh my gosh. Take your pick of the buffet of every different kind of hate group that was there. Toxic male hate groups online, police, former police, RCMP, military, intelligence officers. I mean, good grief. And who is funding them? Well, we know now when we got the statistics from these funding agencies that some of them are big companies. A lot of American companies were supporting the far right freedom truckers, trucking, oil, so on and so forth. So people might say, okay, Pam, that's your political rhetoric. I would invite you to just research the statistics, right? I can't do all that research for everyone, but my research does involve genocide, ecocide, and far-right extremism, and how that's attached to everything that's happening in terms of, the gun lobby and everything else. But don't forget, people always say, when in doubt, erase politics and statistics and research, forget about the facts. Trace the money, right? How many times have you heard that? Where is the vested interest in Ecocide? Well, TC Energy owns Coastal GasLink pipeline that's invading and destroying Wet'suwet'en territory, breaching a whole bunch of environmental laws, damaging wetlands and everything else. The RCMP pension is heavily invested in TC Energy. Is it any surprise then that the RCMP created an entirely new and separate unit called the Community Industry Response Group, that its sole mission is to target, harass, brutalize, arrest Indigenous land defenders if they interfere with pipelines? The very same pipelines that their pensions are invested in. And I'm picking on police because they're so obvious. But also governments have their pensions and public monies invested in things like the extractive industry, fossil fuel industry in disproportionate amounts. So how do we deal with this? Because, set aside the deniers, and I believe they are in the minority. The statistics, the research, the evidence before our eyes of all of the damage to the humans and planet and planetary life is it's too overwhelming to ignore. Climate change is the greatest threat to all life on Earth. It doesn't matter what life you're talking about. And who's causing this? Well, we know the top three offenders: the extractive industry, energy, and agriculture, but also transportation and manufacturing. Notice how you don't see people who don't put their recyclables out in the top contributors to climate change. It's important that we do all that. As individuals, I say we have a moral and legal obligation to do that. We have a treaty obligation to do that. But they would like to make us think that it's all us. And if we need to take our car to take Granny to her cancer treatments once a week, then we're being hypocrites. And so since we're being hypocrites, we just shouldn't do anything. It's really this all or nothing mentality that sometimes gets people trapped. We know the tar sands are killing people with rare cancers. What are we doing about it? Or that pipelines and tankers poison the waterways, clear cutting our forests is reducing our oxygen supply, human indigenous habitat, like you name it. Mining is displacing people and destroying the very plants and traditional medicines that we've always relied on to survive. And who bears the burden? That's the thing. Who bears the burden? It's not like, hey, Corporation X, if you cause all this damage in the billions of dollars and trillions of dollars because it's irreparable, you're going to pay that. No, they get to literally walk away from tailings ponds. Indigenous peoples, racialized peoples, impoverished peoples, the homeless get it first, foremost, and worse. But we are all impacted because that also impacts our economy. This gap between the rich and the poor, where large corporations reap all the benefits, but they're not actually spending it in Canada. They're hoarding their wealth offshore. Or take, for example, mining. And I'm just picking on mining because I always pick on pipelines, but it's largely controlled by large transnational corporations. Canada, in fact, is the country that has the most amount of mining internationally with these corporations. They operate in many different countries, very prominent. In fact, if you travel to different countries where there are Indigenous peoples and you say you're Canadian, that's not a good thing, because Canadian mining companies are, I would argue, based on the facts and the research and statistics, the most dangerous in the world, especially for Indigenous peoples. Because mining isn't just about exploitation of that particular resource, commodity, so to speak. It's also exploitation and damage to local Indigenous peoples, and disproportionately local Indigenous women. Like, the primary focus has been on anti-mining, anti-logging, and environmental destruction. And that's really important work. It's laid the groundwork. But we've forgotten that while we're doing that, what about the Indigenous peoples here in Canada and worldwide that are impacted not just by the environmental destruction, but the terror that's inflicted by these companies with the approval of state governments? So what's less known in the general public is actually what happens. So Indigenous women and little girls, they experience higher rates of sexualized violence, as we know, but in particular from frontline workers in man camps. And yes, they're man camps because they're primarily men committing horrible acts of toxic violence and crimes. Security forces hired by mining companies or transnational corporations. All of those primarily male dominated industries, the transnational corporations, the law enforcement, could be local rival gangs, you name it, are doing this. And state governments have allowed it to continue. Canada knows about it, but Canada says, well, we can't do anything about the fact that, Corporation X, Hudbay Mining, for example, is committing all of these crimes in other countries, because that's not our country. Yeah, okay. So you can't prosecute in that country, but you could change the law. You could have ramifications here in Canada. You could have legal standards and not policies, but they refuse to. They don't hold those corporations to account. So it's resulted in massive human rights violations being ignored, denied, covered up, including massive environmental damage and contamination. And they're often covered up in ways, that it never makes it to the media, or out of court settlements that are confidential and you can't say anything about it, or it's rerouted to confidential, out of sight, out of mind, alternative dispute processes. So the vast majority of the harm and damage to Indigenous peoples and the environment, I would argue, is still largely hidden from people. And that's on purpose. If you keep the people in the dark about what corporations are doing in the name of profit, that also keeps us in the dark about who's benefiting and who's not. It sounds very shocking. It doesn't always get a lot of media attention. There's very little protective or remedial action that's happening from law enforcement right now or public safety officials. And here's just like a couple of examples. Like, there's a bazillion examples, but Hudbay Minerals, it's a major transnational Canadian mining company that has faced court proceedings in other countries and in Canada for the reported murders of Indigenous leaders, gang rapes of Indigenous women located near mines. The rapes have been reported to have been committed by the security forces that were hired by mining companies like Sky Resources or local ones. Hudbay's also, had legal troubles in Peru, where protesters are calling them out for massive human rights violations attached to mines there, like open pit copper mines, for example. Hudbay in Canada has used the courts and its own security and the RCMP to keep Indigenous peoples, Cree in particular, off their own lands, sued them, got injunctions against them. Barrick Gold Corporation is a Canadian mining company. It's the largest gold mining company in the world, or it was the last time I looked at the stats. They operate mines in a whole lot of places like Papua New Guinea, where human rights activists have documented grave human rights violations against Indigenous peoples, and in particular, Indigenous women and girls, where they've been subjected to violent gang rapes committed by the security forces hired by Barrick Gold. And so, you can just go on and on. There's, Barrick Gold on the African continent, and they have been reported as violence, beatings, gang rapes, forced removals, you name it. None of these human rights violations have abated. And that's the problem. Okay, once we do know about it, now what are we going to do? It could be anvil mining, Royal Dutch Shell. Like, human watchdogs have reported that Shell has funded violence and death in Nigeria by providing funds to rival opposite violent gangs to cause like so much problems that they can go about their business without people knowing, and ending up in deaths and gang rapes. And notice that in all of these circumstances, it's not just violence, beatings, and environmental destruction, gang rapes and the sexualized violence of Indigenous women and girls, exploitative, extractive, sometimes lethal. And then look at what's happening in the oil fields in North Dakota. The man camps there have increased and made that local area the area with the highest amount of rapes, and primarily against Indigenous women. The numbers of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and human trafficking around these man camps, like off the charts. And so closer to home in Canada, Alberta tar sands, not just cancer, not just environmental destruction, but increased violence against women, and not just Indigenous women, but also in local communities, higher rates of domestic violence, assault, sexual assault. And so you see how you can't just deal with one without dealing with the other. Trans Mountain Pipeline, they harass Secwepemc women all the time. Coastal GasLink Pipeline, harass Wet'suwet'en women all the time. Corporate and individual fishing fleets harass and threaten and commit violence against Mi'kmaq fishers, all aided by governments, by those corporate interests, sometimes local people, but law enforcement. Almost all of these groups, toxic white men that are affiliated with some of these other groups. So while we're working on stopping the extraction of natural resources or environmental destruction, we can't leave out what's happening on the side and the violence that's being committed against Indigenous women and girls, or the silencing of Indigenous land defenders, or the arrests, incarceration, the bullying that they do with civil court proceedings to keep us quiet. So what we need now is real action on both genocide and ecocide. And that's going to require two things. It's going to require, first, a national action plan to address genocide. It should be federal, provincial, territorial, municipal governments and First Nation governments. But if not, then the people and First Nations need to come together in our treaty relationship and start getting shit done. The second thing is a climate action plan to end genocide that includes Indigenous people and includes ending the violence against Indigenous people, because you can't do one without the other. It's just like the National Action Plan to end genocide against women, Indigenous women, has to include things like land back. Because when women have control over their own territories, they can say F you to man camps. So do you see how those two things are tied together? So we really need Canadians to step forward, do what they can to push governments to take action. And we have the power to do that. We've been successful in the past. But we also need environmental activists, climate activists, and lawyers and advocates to look beyond the forest and the ocean and see the genocide that's happening right before their eyes. We need all of you, everybody, to realize we cannot save the planet without Indigenous peoples. And the future of Indigenous peoples depends on the health of the planet. All of our lives depend on it. We're on the front lines of this battle. We're constantly criminalized, arrested, brutalized by law enforcement. But we need to get behind these Indigenous women and other land defenders. We are the ones who started the largest social movement in Canada, the Idle No More movement, that went global. It was the longest lasting because of legislative amendments to laws in Canada that would end protections for large bodies of water. Like, we're leading the way, but it's not just for us. It's for you too. And that's why you need to be a part of everything that we're doing. And we need to be a part of everything that you're doing so that we can break out of these complex laws, policies, practices, and relationships and their intersections and find a way to break through that barrier. Because We've tried negotiations, litigation, public education, advocacy, but now we're left with no choice. We've tried courts. We must abide by the law to protect our people and the planet, and that's going to require escalating action. We're already putting our lives on the line. We need to be supported by all of you, by everyone you know. Stand behind Indigenous women warriors. That's literally the solution to this. Land back, respecting their human rights, because we're putting our lives on the line for all of you. And as long as Canada acts like an outlaw, we need you more than ever. We need the world to see, hear, and act to end genocide and ecocide. And that the only way to do that is to have sustained support of Indigenous women on the front lines and those behind the scenes. Things like supporting land back, treaty rights. It's not about politics. It's not whether you agree. This is the solution. We know that. So that's the call to action. Be a part of ending genocide against women now. Follow their lead. Let them say what the call to action is in your area. Give land back to Indigenous peoples. Let them be in control of their own territories and work in partnership to end the ecocide and the genocide that goes together, because anything less condemns the planet. And I always say we have a moral obligation, but a legal one, to protect every living thing on this planet and have a voice for those that don't. So I know all of you are there. I know you're all pumped to go and protest right after this, but I'm being serious. We really need to look at these two things together and always ask that question: is what I'm advocating for in the environment good for Indigenous women, good for Indigenous peoples? Does it go hand in hand? How does it address that? Because if it doesn't, maybe we need to ask Indigenous peoples for a better solution. Thank you so much for listening to me. I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. And I welcome any skill testing, hard question. Even if you want to ask me about Pierre Poilievre, I will answer it.
If it's okay, I might help to just see whose questions come up first. This is an incredibly huge topic. I hope that we can also remember the links to education in the questions, because we do have very limited time for questions. So let's make sure that they are the ones that get to the heart of this conference, if possible, of education and what teachers, educators, and everybody can bring to their classrooms. I think this is a really good forum for that. And Pam has so much content out there already that probably has the answer to a lot of the more broad questions that you might have. So let's just keep that in mind as we go through this. Pam, thanks you for much. Can't even speak. Thanks so much for your inspiring speech today. It's so clear we need to act on ecocide and genocide now. What is one suggestion you might have to empower youth when they feel they lack agency or power when faced with this systemic issues? Folks become fearful and anxious and disengaged from the news and politics. So what is your take on youth making tangible, long-lasting change in our communities?
Thanks for that question. And I would argue they already are. The problem isn't with them or what they can do or what more they can do. It's, are we listening? As non-youth, I wish I was still youth, but as non-youth or people in positions of power or even just positions of influence or with financial support, are we listening? Are we supporting the youth? Because I have yet to meet a youth group that isn't fighting to save the environment, fighting to end racism, fighting to have accountability in government, fighting to help Indigenous peoples. I mean, they get it. They literally get it. They have like this basic common sense of, oh, that right, wrong. Yeah, let's work towards having right. They don't politicize everything. And that's the beauty of the youth. And so there's a lot of wisdom there, because as grownups, we get so tied up into conservative, liberal, NDP, federal, provincial, like all that stuff, that we forget to really just focus on the issue. And anytime you see Indigenous youth acting in a way, whether it's organized with a youth group or not, you can support them. You can even support them on social media, like, comment, and share their content. Watch more of their content, support them on Patreon. Teachers, especially in schools, my gosh, the education system is such a perfect place to strengthen and empower the voices of young people. It's one of the reasons why I have a Warrior Kids podcast. Yes, I want 4 and 5-year-olds to do the exact same thing and to learn strategies about how to face all of the vitriol and nastiness and denial and dismissal in society, how to, develop a little armor so that you can just focus your attention not on the trolls, but on the good work that you're doing and the people who will be impacted by it. So I don't have anything for the youth. I think the youth have all the solutions. I just think we need to listen and support them more.
So the Warrior Kids podcast is in the chat. Any next questions?
And for adults, in case you want the adult version, there's the Warrior Life podcast. And I'm not promoting my podcast myself here, but my podcast is effectively just a tool for Indigenous land defenders and activists and human rights, advocates, like every Indigenous person that's out there leading the way in some area. So one of the things teachers can do, or educators or professional development, is if you want to know what's happening in Wet'suwet'en territory, the last person I'm going to listen to is a panel of 3 white men on CBC News debating whether we even have rights. I'm first going to listen to people from Wet'suwet'en territory. And on my podcast, you get to listen to the people that were in it. And it's the same across the country, whether it's 1492 Land Back Lane or Mi'kmaq. I mean, we were literally doing a podcast for 1492 Land Back Lane with Skylar Williams in Mohawk territory when the police come and he had to leave. We had to cut the podcast down. So that's literally how life and death, all of this stuff is. And all of those resources are there and it's free and you don't hear any commercials.
Amazing. So I know that not hearing commercials means that you're also probably not really getting paid for it. So
No.
That's very generous on your part. Thank you. The next question is, what qualities of Mi'kmaq education can be most helpful in sharing a Mi'kmaq worldview of all my relations?
I'm just going to assume that this is a non-Mi'kmaq person or teacher or someone who wants to include more Mi'kmaq education in their area, because my answer would be different if it was a Mi'kmaq person. But it's just keep doing it. Like literally everything that's in your class assignment, every activity that you could possibly do, think, how can I incorporate something related to Mi'kmaq people in this? Is it home ec and you're learning how to cook? Well, why don't you cook with traditional foods, learn the history behind those traditional foods, like say salmon or fiddleheads or clams, how we used to fish it, what we do to protect them now, which ones are in danger, what they could do today and forever to protect them. I mean, literally everything. And yes, that includes science, all you engineers out there. Can weave in Mi'kmaq content, but source it responsibly. There's almost as many pretendians as there are Mi'kmaq people and Wolastoqey people. So source it responsibly. Make sure you're actually getting a Mi'kmaq person with expertise in that area. Don't contact me if you want to know corporate tax law, because I failed tax law in law school. Contact me if it's on Indigenous stuff, if it's on lands and, all of those things. So make sure you've got their expertise and it's a person, and pay them. No relationship with Indigenous peoples is a valuable one if it's one-sided. If you're always just saying, hey, can you give me a source for this? Hey, can you point me in the direction to that? Hey, I need some, recommendations. Hey, can you give me some research? Hey, can you come speak to my class? That's great. But pay them for their labor. Pay them for their labor, pay them for their time. Those are the kinds of ways in which we can have a mutually beneficial relationship. And don't get me on a rant about that.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. I know this was like a lot of information all at once, and a lot of it was really hard to digest.
I see one. It says, what Indigenous methodologies can best share this, like the worldview? Okay.
That's a bit of a follow-up to the Mi'kmaq education one, but yeah, that's good.
Yeah, it's good because I worry about so-called indigenous methodologies because there are no indigenous people. There are Mi'kmaq people, Wolastoqey people, Inuit people, Métis Nation people. And so we all have different ways of looking at the world, different knowledges, different ways about recording it, tracking it, measuring it, like everything you can imagine. There is no such thing as an indigenous methodology. The more you can use like local, authentic, expert people in these working relationships, that's the best. So say, for example, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but everyone thinks an indigenous methodology is having a talking circle. Not every indigenous community or First Nation did that. Some of the traditional nations, they all stood when people spoke, and it was engaging, and they weren't stopped, and like everyone taking a turn. So we've got to not pan-indigenize the work or education or methods that we do. If you're in Mi'kma'ki, find out what Mi'kmaq methods and information and experts are out there. Same with Wolastoqey. Just do not use, and there's a lot of writing, even by some indigenous academics, about indigenous methodologies as if it's all one thing. There's no such thing. So anyone arguing there is, have some second thoughts.
I really appreciate the fact that what happens to the earth and indigenous people are one and the same. I don't really have a question. I just want to echo and praise the connection there, and that environmental educators should keep this awareness in their work. This is a solid path forward. Thank you, Pamela, for sharing with us.
Thank you for that comment. I really appreciate it, because my other rant usually is the historicization or limiting of indigenous people. So even educators who do include it say, back in the day, Mi'kmaq people used to live in wigwams, and we used to make birch bark, this and that. All true, all important. But hello, we're here today. Like, we're nations, we're polities, we're everything. Like, why aren't we also bringing them into the future? So I don't like the historicization. And then I don't like the limiting of what we are, as if we are a culture. We're not a culture. We're strong sovereign nations. So in addition to making, I don't know, dream catchers in class, why aren't you talking about different ways of governing, and compare that to how Canadians are governed, and what the differences are, and what are Mi'kmaq laws, and what are Mi'kmaq businesses, and how are they working with the environment, and how are they making part, like, bring us into the here and now. And don't just, celebrate, I don't know, say Sitting Bull, for example. I will always celebrate Sitting Bull, but how about native TikTok? How about our native social media superstars? Like, everyone, native and non-native, needs to see our heroes and our influencers and really cool people, and see that native people kick ass. And we have some of the best TikToks on native TikTok. And you might not think that's important, but it is, because they're educational and they're making calls to action and organizing people about how to address environmental issues. So just think about indigenous Mi'kmaq people in everything, not just history class.
Amazing. I get the feeling that there's a lot of people who are very glad to have heard this talk, and also feeling the need for a break. I wonder if it's okay if we just give it a second to see if there is another question, but there were some really heavy topics here that might have not been what was expected. So to make sure that everybody's taking good care of themselves, and especially if there was anybody listening with youth, that maybe we have some extra time to chat with the youth, or if they might have a question directly for Pam, then now would be a really good time to uplift that. Because this was listed as a youth-friendly session, we might have gotten a little bit off to the wayside, and I think that's okay. It's really important to make sure that we are not policing what people say and what their lived experiences are just because it is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I'm really appreciative of your honesty and your clarity. Yeah, so I'm wondering, I don't even know what kind of resources to offer people, but Yeah, okay, so a lot of people are agreeing in the chat. So maybe we could just end this the same way that we began, with some deep breaths. And Pam's website is in the chat and also linked on her profile on the conference page. We have a lot of other workshops going on, as well as a safe space for white questions happening at the end of the day today, and a whole other day of presentations for tomorrow. Yeah, Pam, thank you so much. Willaleen, let's all just take a deep breath, shall we? Together.
Thank you, everybody.